All right, let's get started. Again, welcome everyone. Please make sure that your audio is muted as you are entering the meeting and as you get situated. My name is Victoria, and on behalf of the Education Work Group, we would like to thank you all for attending our May Lunch and Learn presentation on navigating uncertainty by building inclusive excellence, components for change. A few housekeeping items before I introduce today's speaker. First, we will be recording today's presentation, which will be made available on the intranet over the next few days. Everyone present here today will receive a certificate for their attendance. Today's presentation is eligible for 2 continuing education credits, which will be listed on your certificate. We will have a short survey after we end for the day. Please make sure you fill that out if you have a few moments. We would love your feedback on today's presentation. And lastly, we do appreciate and strongly encourage your questions. However, please hold your questions until the end of the presentation. And now I have the privilege of introducing today's speaker. Dr. Richards received her undergraduate degree in business administration from the University of Phoenix and master's degree from the University of Denver Graduate School of Social Work with a concentration in community and leadership development. Dr. Richards recently completed her PhD at Colorado State University in the School of Social Work with a concentration in social work and higher education. She is an educator who has been an adjunct professor at the University of Denver Graduate School of Social Work, teaching multicultural social work practice and community theories and practice. She is also instructed at Colorado State University, teaching social work generalist practices and community engagement practices. At CU School of Medicine, she is a member of the CU Leads track faculty team, developed the Race and Medicine elective course, and was a co-instructor in the newly developed COVID-19 elective. Dr. Richards was also appointed the director of the new CU School of Medicine service learning curriculum. Prior to her recent appointment as the inaugural Associate Vice Chancellor for Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Community Engagement for the Anschutz Medical Campus, and has since been promoted to the Vice Chancellor of DEICE. Previous 11 years, Dr. Richards was the inaugural Director of Diversity and Inclusion at the University of Colorado School of Medicine. Which also included being the program manager for the BA, BS, ND program, which is a combined pipeline program for diverse Colorado high school students to medical school. Her research interests and passions include areas of community engagement and best practices to increase equity and social justice by eliminating racism and disparities in health, education, and the other domains of social determinants of health, as well as equitable recruitment, retention, and inclusion practices for minority faculty, residents, students, and staff, and understanding the role of sense of belonging for underrepresented minorities in higher education institutions. When asked what drove you to the medical profession and your specific specialty, her response is, quote, "The hope that access to quality healthcare and high quality education someday becomes a basic human right for all." CU School of Medicine and the Anschutz Medical Campus have these values embedded within their missions, and it is through developing relationships and partnerships that has allowed me both the privilege and opportunities to align my personal and professional development with these values. End quote. I would really like to take a moment to thank Dr. Richards for being here today. I will stop sharing so Allie can pull up Dr. Richards' slides, and then I believe we will be ready whenever you are.
Thank you so much, Victoria, for that introduction, and for the team who has invited me to be here. I'm very excited to present to you today and actually hopefully have some time for some dialogue thereafter. Next slide, please. So I have no financial disclosures to report. However, I am a mother, I am a wife, I am a daughter, a sister, an auntie, a friend, a community member, and a Christian. I'm a social worker, I'm a leader, educator, and scholar, and I'm a proud Black woman. Next slide. I know that you all have come together and you come together often as a community. For the purposes of our engagement today, I think that it's important that we have some community agreements. First of all, confidentiality is one. What is said here stays here, but what is learned here should be shared broadly. I want you to be present with an open mind and an open heart. This is a learning community. So this is not about blame or shame. When we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and oftentimes even community engagement, we think of it from that good person, bad person perspective. That is not what this is about. It is about really sharing some learning that hopefully will allow you all to think differently about the work that you are doing as we move as a campus community to be much more inclusive, much more equitable, and much more engaging. This is brave space. Oftentimes you hear people say safe space. I think it's important that we have brave space. And so be brave to lean into discomfort, to speak your first draft. Don't worry about editing it. Whatever comes to mind when we have time for Q&A, I want you to be able to just speak your first draft. I want you to be open, though it's not here, I want you to also be open to different perspectives. Your perspective is based on your lived experiences, but there are other perspectives that are out there. So seek to understand as you would seek to be understood. And then engage and listen for understanding. Next slide. So today's objectives really is to define uncertainty and components that drive that uncertainty. Describe the structural factors that impact diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. I'm going to define bias and how bias impacts our everyday decision making. Again, I'm going to stop at this bullet to say, and you'll hear me say and reiterate several times, that this is not about good person, bad person. But what our brain does naturally is make associations based on our lived experiences. That's what we'll actually be able to define more specifically and talk about today. I'm going to introduce to maybe some and reacquaint to others the socio-ecological model that we use in our work here in the Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Community Engagement, and how to integrate that model to increase inclusive excellence for change. And then I never want to do these presentations without leaving a call for action. And the call is to create a culture of belonging. If we can create that culture of belonging across our campus, interwoven in the fabric of how we do business here, we will be able to increase study sections to be more inclusive and diverse. And as I have looked over kind of some highlights of the guidelines for your NCI guidelines for enhancing diversity, I think that it's really important that if we create that culture of belonging, you'll be able to certainly make progress, even more immediate progress on the guidelines that have been outlined in your Cancer Center Support Grant. Next slide, please. So uncertainty ahead. Is it uncertainty or is it opportunity? Next slide. So what you see before you is CLEAR's three basic types of uncertainty. What is uncertainty and why does it matter? Whether it is in relation to climate change, disease outbreak, financial volatility, natural disasters, political settlements, civil unrest, every media headline seems to assert that things are uncertain and increasingly so. This defines uncertainty in really three core areas. The first is fuzziness. That's a lack of definite or sharp distinctions. And you can see the characteristics that are listed here. And then there's ambiguity, which highlights how our brains sort information in some ways. It's one-to-many relationships when we talk about ambiguity. There's discord, which is a disagreement in choosing among several alternatives, and there's non-specificity. Two or more alternatives are left unspecified. As you see those descriptors there, we're going to focus on the diversity aspect. And there's an article from the Greater Good Science Center that was published in 2020 that really talks about uncertainty. And it really highlights how our brains perceive ambiguity as a threat and tries to protect us by diminishing our ability to focus on anything other than creating certainty. It further suggests that even though evolution might have rigged our brains to resist uncertainty, we can never know what the future will bring. We have faith. We work to chart our courses to success in hopes that, for the most part, we can control our future. But the question I have for you is, can we ever really know what the future will bring? Next slide. And then 2020 hit and the pandemic happened. And we know that, as stated before, that there are many factors that contribute to uncertainty. And we also know that living with uncertainty is really hard. In improbable situations like the pandemic, which has massively disrupted our routines and utterly destroyed our best laid plans, we need to learn to live with ambiguity. There is a mathematician by the name of John Allen Paulus that wrote, "Uncertainty is the only certainty there is. Knowing how to live with insecurity is the only security." What we know for sure is that, in our everyday lives, we try to chart our courses. When the pandemic hit, what it did is it really shined a brighter light on the need to train and develop systems that are culturally responsive. Here in the United States, we continue to work towards equity, inclusion, and access. You're now seeing from a national perspective, NIH, other granting institutions now, other granting institutions that are really saying that if you do not have guidelines and a diversity plan, and engage in work that's much more equitable and inclusive, that it puts funding in an uncertain place. So being culturally responsive to people is a really important thing. Next slide. So how do we control the uncontrollable? Because the reality of it is there are so much uncontrollable things that are out there. So what you see in front of you is a picture of I'm borrowing now from engineering and applied sciences. And this is a new actuator. And what we know about actuators is that they receive a source of energy and uses it to move something. When I think about uncertainty, it really is an opportunity to make some changes. There was a study done at Harvard John A. Paulson School of Engineering and Applied Sciences that really harnessed the idea that if you are building a skyscraper, minor instabilities could bring the whole structure down in a fraction of a second. What we saw with the pandemic is that life as we knew it changed tremendously. The unexpected behavior of an actuator really is grounded and rooted, from a balloon experiment, non-relational between pressure and volume, meaning that an increase in volume does not necessarily increase the pressure. I want to take it a little bit further and talk about something as simple as blowing up a balloon. We know that the first few blows in a balloon are the hardest. I try regularly to blow balloons up. And after about the second pump or breath that I blow into it, if in fact it does not inflate, I'm moving on to something else because I don't have time. I don't have the patience. I don't have the time. But we also know that if you stick with it and do what we know naturally to do, is that after critical pressure, it becomes much easier. So for me, this represents a way to attempt to control the uncontrollable. Fast moving instabilities trigger large changes in internal pressure, in internal extension, in extension, shape, and exerted forces with only small changes in volume. So I want you to think about the concept of applying equity, diversity, and inclusion and uncertainty as we think about changing the pressures to create changes in volume. DEI work, community engagement, impactful DEI work, and impactful equity and inclusion takes time. And we now are seeing the emergence since the pandemic of this becoming the very fabric of the structures in which we operate. But what we don't see is that there is so much pressure put on organizations, institutions, businesses, et cetera, even individuals to change, that we become very frustrated instead of understanding that we have to chart the course and that this work takes time. Next slide. So is it uncertainty or is it opportunity? So I'm going to bring it contextually to health. Next slide, please. The concept of controlling the uncontrollable in health. In our work, we have to look at ways to solve complex problems as it relates to health. I put this sign up knowing that you all understand what health is, but I want to ground you, do some level setting for this particular presentation. So we know that the World Health Organization defines health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being determined by many things: social and economic factors, physical environment, healthcare, health behaviors, genes, and biology. Next slide, please. So what makes us healthy? We know that genes and biology, 10%. You all know about the Genome Project, which the studies were done that said that 99.9% of our phenotypes are the same. We know that what makes us healthy is our healthcare system, the physical environment, health behaviors, but a large factor is the social and economic factors. When I think about the work that and the research that you all are engaged in and the need to really increase the study sections, when I think about the physical environment, when I think about health behaviors, and when I think about social and economic factors are critical to how you approach communities, individuals, and engaging in this work. Next slide, please. So we have to talk about the social determinants of health. We have to talk about the economic and social conditions that influence the health of people and communities. This really is shaped by the amount of money, power, and resources people have access to. And it's also influenced by policies, institutions, and systems created by people with majority status. When you hear me say majority status throughout this presentation, it is focused on the white dominant culture, who have access to money, power, and resources. And ultimately, the results is that not everyone experiences the same opportunities for good health. When you think about the work that needs to be done in terms of expanding the research, we have to know that from a historical perspective, Not everyone has started at the same place. So how do we make that shift when there's so many things that right now are so uncertain about and in the work that we are doing to bring people to a optimal or at least a better state of health, eliminating health equities and eliminating health disparities and increasing health equity. Next slide. So what is equity? It's important to really talk about that. When you look at these 3 slides, when I think about, first we start, years ago, we started with equality. So when we look at these boxes, we see that the first box that is focused on equity, next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. That the equality box really says that everyone is given the same resources, but yet don't have the same access. When we think about equity, it's about giving people what they need to succeed. So, and when you make that comparison to equality, equity says, okay, we see that everyone has different needs based on socioeconomic, physical environment, those factors that influence the social determinants of health. But yet, there is still a barrier. When we think about moving from equity to justice, we're removing all barriers to allow equitable and inclusive access. And everyone has what they need. Next slide. So I like to focus on, click one more time, please. Equity is really a structural issue. When we think about an apple orchard, if it's an orchard that is specific to green apples and a red apple appears, we oftentimes think that this is some sort of individual issue. And we don't really think about the structural factors that really have created the difference in the green apple orchard. Structural factors really are related to influence and behavior. Next slide. But what we really need to focus on is there's more to just the apple. There is more needed for the apples to really thrive. And when I think about that, I think about what are the other structures that are needed to create healthy crop of apples. So you have to think about the soil. Has the soil been cultivated in a way that the apple trees can grow? What about the air quality? What about access to the amount of sunshine? We have to recognize that there are factors such as recruitment, how we sponsor for opportunities, and how we network that actually influences the end product that we're trying to produce. These are structural inequities that we must address. There are structural inequities that we must address. And we have to move the needle and make the progress. There has been research done after research studies that have informed us that there are inequities and that there are various different factors. In 2003, there was a report that was put out that really, it was called the Sullivan Report, and it really was focused on what are the structural issues that are preventing us from a health perspective to reach health equity. And so I give the simplistic example here of the apple orchard. We know that there are many factors that help to produce the type of crop that is needed. And we also know that from a structural inequity perspective, that there are macro level systems, social factors, institutions, ideology, and processes that interact with one another to generate and reinforce the inequities. Next slide, please. Thank you. It's important for us to be able to talk about and specifically look at the historical aspect of why we have the inequities that we do. Oftentimes people don't want to talk about it, and oftentimes we feel as though, again, I'm going back to what I said earlier, this is not about good person, bad person, but it is about having the facts so that we can create structural systems that will produce better outcomes for all. When I say all, that also includes underrepresented populations, women, minorities, underrepresented minorities, across the systems. So we have to look at first race. Click, please. So race is created to justify enslaving people from Africa. It was an economic engine for our country. Policies and practices that consolidate and protect power bestowed unearned economical, social, cultural, and political advantage to people called white and unearned disadvantage to people of color. The national narrative, ideology, belief system that about people of color being less than human, less than white, justifies mistreatment and inequities, and also produced white supremacy. The concept of race was created to disenfranchise and disempower people of color. Next slide. Inequitable outcomes and experiences resulting from policy decisions in health, housing, employment, education, and life expectancy reinforces white supremacist beliefs and ideology. Dominant narratives uses disparate outcomes as evidence of white superiority. It promotes whiteness as a normal and desirable and justifies inequity. So when you think about wanting to increase the study sections for research, if we have structural, historical systems, policies, and practices that have been built to promote this ideology, and we also look at the historical atrocities, not just of the Tuskegee experiment, but so many others, we have a greater understanding why BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color, do not trust the healthcare system and do not want to participate in research studies. It is important to know that. And it is important to be able to design policies, practices, and programming that helps to dismantle those systems so that it will create a much more inclusive environment for all. Next click, please. Dominant narratives about race, family, media, society, coupled with radicalized structural arrangements and differential outcomes by race all prime us to believe that BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color, are inferior to white people, create and maintain harmful associations consciously and unconsciously about people of color. This is a very simplistic way of looking at how history informs the present. And the examples are, voting rights, FHA loans, residential segregation, access to education, green space, resources, jobs, hiring, and advancement. And I would even put in there research. Next slide. How do we deconstruct structural oppression? What are the opportunities ahead versus the uncertainty? Often in the literature, you will hear the term structural racism, a system in which public policies, institutional practices, cultural representation, and other norms work in various, often reinforcing ways to perpetuate racial group inequities. This is the default system that we all exist in. That is the reality of our life. When we talk about bias and we talk about whether it's implicit or explicit, remember, it is the most natural thing that our brain does, is that we make associations based on our lived experiences. I use the term structural oppression interchangeably with structural racism. We have to recognize that when we're working towards equity, there are many marginalized populations that are not limited to race and ethnicity, but those dimensions of diversity tend to be highlighted. So using this term structural oppression is more inclusive of how our current system advantages some groups while disadvantaging others. So you'll hear me use structural oppression. Next slide, please. So this is our socio-ecological model. It is one way to deconstruct structural oppression, and to really look at the various different structures that perpetuate oppression, and then learn how to work to change those systems. What we know is that in looking at the socio-ecological model, that it looks at the cross-cutting domains, looks at the individual, the interpersonal, the community, and the structural society. Because what we know is that the norms, bias, are perceived, the ability to act in terms of skills and efficacy and access come through the interpersonal actions. Motivation is attitudes and beliefs, and knowledge, information. And those are cross-cutting across the domains of this socio-ecological model. This model, it comes from the social science literature, and it really is one way of analyzing and understanding how the structures that we live in impact health, well-being, and success. So the next few slides will really help us to understand and to work together to consider it, how it impacts the work that we do. Next slide, please. So at the individual level, it focuses on you. It focuses on me. It focuses on us as individuals. So some of the questions that we have to ask and reconcile with are, what are our core belief systems? What are our values? Who are we as a person? What biases do you have, and how are you working to mitigate them? Because we all have bias. I have bias. You have bias. We all have bias. That has a tendency to create defensiveness and a wrong mindset for learning. Remember at the very beginning, I said to be open to different perspectives, seek to understand as you would seek to be understood. So when you think about evidence-based strategies, evidence-based strategies that you can try, such as recognizing and challenging stereotypes, individuating perceived variability, considering your own internal motivational message, perspective taking is so important. And oftentimes, because of the demands of our work, we do not step back to take a breath to really understand, or at least seek to understand, other perspectives. When we talk about the individual level work, this is hard work. Because again, we never want to, we're not talking about good person, bad person. We're not talking about blame, shame, or guilt. This is just the way our brains are wired. Next slide, please. So when we think about deconstructing, I asked you all to take some of your homework was to talk about, or excuse me, was to take the Harvard implicit bias test, implicit association test. We'd like to think of implicit bias as a habit because it really is. It is what our brain does naturally, but it can be changed with deliberate practice. If I were before you, I would probably ask you to turn to the person next to you and say what surprised you about taking the test. Now, there are people oftentimes that will tell me, I've taken this test before. I didn't really feel it was important. I didn't really feel it was necessary for me to take the test again. While that is legitimate, here's what happens when you don't. Our biases change. It changes by the perceptions that we and the messaging that we get from media, our interactions every day, our decision making every day. There are many aspects of things that influence our bias. What I want you to do is to take the test as often as you can. We are more subjected to our bias when we're fatigued, when we have, and I have to laugh, this comes from a study that was done that says that when we have excessive cognitive loads, and I think to myself, because it was a study that was done at a health institution, an educational institution, I think we're always at excessive cognitive loads. So when you know that things are even more challenging and heavier and harder because of all the current demands, it's really, really important for us to pause and take a moment to understand when our bias is at play and how we can mitigate or move beyond that bias. I want to give credit for the slide. It is from a longitudinal study that was done called BRIM, and we have it with their approval. So we know that implicit bias is a habit. Thoughts and actions can be changed, again, with deliberate practice. Next slide. Implicit bias is not explicit bias. Next click, please. Thank you. So explicit bias, click again, please. We are aware, it is controllable, it is intentionable, and it is endorsed. Next slide. It leads to our conscious beliefs. Next slide. And then there's implicit bias. It's unaware, difficult to control, and unintentional. And it leads to habits of the mind. Click again. Implicit and explicit bias influences our stereotypes. That's, click one more time. Yeah, the impact of stereotypes. It's important for us to name what those are. So there's expectancy bias. We're expecting certain behaviors and traits or abilities in individuals based on stereotypes about their social category. For instance, there is a need to increase representation in study sections. You would like to have more underrepresented minority BIPOC individuals engage in the research. I want to take you back to the slide that talked about the social determinants of health. And when you have you don't have to go back there, it's okay. Yes, thank you. When you have individuals who don't have basic needs met, we can get into a situation where we are thinking that, you want to recruit differently, you want to have difference in your research, but our expectancy bias based upon stereotype could say that, you know what, folks of color don't want to participate in these studies. They don't trust the system. So therefore, I may not necessarily be equipped or have access to going in to talk to individuals who are different than I am to help educate them. Again, if individuals do not have, if they are experiencing those traits that are associated with the social determinants of health, research may not be their top priority. But how do you engage with difference to build relationships, to educate, to build trust that then could lead to people wanting to engage further in the research that you are doing? Next click. And then there is competency bias. Members of historically lower status groups are presumed to be less competent than members of groups that have typically held positions of authority. That is not the case, but these lists of biases can be harmful. They're harmful in that they help to perpetuate the norm that has been based on the dominant culture. And quite frankly, we know diverse teams do better, the outcomes are better, and ultimately your research will be better, which is why the national organizations are requiring that there is not just guidelines, but actual impact and better health outcomes, because we have to do better. But if we have expectancy bias and if we have competency bias, they become barriers. Next slide. And then when we think about the interpersonal level, we think, remember that implicit bias is the iceberg that really can sink our conscious beliefs and intentions and how we interact with others. We talk about structural issues that contribute to bias impacting our everyday decision-making. But here we can only see 10% of the iceberg, which is above the water. The rest is below the surface. That is culture. Culture is very simple to, similar to the iceberg. It has aspects that are visible and many others that can only be suspected, guessed, or learned as you grow to understand cultures. Like the iceberg, the visible part of the culture is the only small part of the whole. We must examine the more we must examine this more when we talk about the socio-ecological framework for building inclusive communities. Next slide. I'm going to move through these pretty quickly. Next slide. So as part of understanding our own biases and stereotypes, we also need to understand that there is a such thing as microaggressions. It was described in 1970 by Dr. Chester Pierce, but it was actually brought to the forefront by Dr. Daryl Sue. And microaggressions, simply defined, are everyday slights, indignities, put downs, and insults that members of marginalized groups experience in their day-to-day interactions with individuals who are often unaware that they have engaged in offensive or demeaning way. It's important to understand the impact of microaggressions. There's depression is nine times more likely. Institutional satisfaction. This is where we see individuals wanting to leave this institution or other institutions because they don't feel valued. They don't feel as though they belong. They don't feel heard. They don't feel seen. And when you think about increasing representation in studies, individuals from BIPOC communities, well documented. So everything that I have and I'm giving you today is well documented, is well referenced in the literature and in the research. But individuals feel as though, oh, here we are with another atrocity as it relates to engaging in research, and I don't want to engage. And racial microaggressions devalue experiences, and it has a negative impact on learning, academic performance, and personal wellness. Next slide. There's a such thing as stereotype threat. And really what it talks about is, how does this really work? Next slide. So it's Thank you. Stereotype threats, I'll just touch on it a little bit. You'll have access to these slides. Situational cues that make salient and stereotype groups identify active stereotype threat. That is solo status and priming. I'll talk a little bit more about that. Then there's the internal mechanisms. There's the anxiety. It produces anxiety, negative cognition and emotions. It reduces effort. It reduces self-control. It reduces working memory capacity. It's a physiological arousal. Individuals that experience stereotype threat, the consequences is impaired performance, discounting the importance or validity of feedback. Again, these are, when you think about increasing the work that you are doing and making it much more inclusive, we have to eliminate stereotype threat. Next slide. And so we talked a little bit about that interpersonal interaction. Next is community. Next slide, please. When we think about utilizing the socio-ecological model and at the community level, it includes the communities surrounding us, both internal and external. For the internal community, what are we doing to create inclusive environments and equitable opportunities? For educators, what are you doing to teach about diversity, equity, and inclusion? How are we creating space for conversations about diverse perspectives? Are all voices heard? Are minoritized individuals asked to speak for their entire group of people? Because that's a form of microaggressions. For researchers, are your minoritized learners and postdocs offered equitable opportunities for growth, grants, and professional development? For administrators and leaders, are your staff and faculty offered opportunities for professional development and mentorship in an equitable way? Think about how awards are nominated or selected. Is this equitable? And then for clinicians, how are you treating your clients, staff, and team members? How do you allow each member to contribute to the fullest extent of their abilities and license? Are we reinforcing traditional hierarchies or trying to level the playing field? Next slide. And we have to talk about structural systems. What can we do? What work can we do? And how can we do it to bring in and support individuals with marginalized identity in these areas? So when we think about laws and policies, the state and local government, community groups and organizations, business, K-12 education, healthcare delivery organizations, where do we see inequities in this work? Next slide. Stereotype priming. So this was a study that was done, an evaluation that was done, an NIH Director's Pioneer Award. In 2004, the advertisement for this award really focused on risk-taking, which was emphasized. And we know that from research, risk-taking is synonymous with a strong association with men. But after some work, in 2005, the emphasis on risk was removed. And as a result of that, there was much more diversity in terms of who was nominated for Pioneer Award and who received it. I'm going to just briefly highlight a study, the Farmington Heart Study and Epidemiological Cardiovascular Disease, a historical perspective. I've had this study for a while, and I look at it quite often. And what happened, this is a study that's just recently celebrated, I believe, 70 years of how it has contributed to understanding cardiovascular disease. I look at the timeline often. The study started in about 1944, when President Franklin Roosevelt was diagnosed with hypertension and heart failure. I'm sorry, advance the slides. I'm sorry, I get ahead of myself. That's why, keep going. Yes, so it's an insight into research approaches and different perspectives. So it started in 1940. When the President Roosevelt was diagnosed with hypertension. And And then in 1947, the U.S. Public Health Plan for Heart Failure Study was enacted. Framingham, that is a typo on my part. It's the Framingham Heart Study, and it was done in Framingham, Massachusetts. And so this study has continued again for 70 years. What I want to bring your attention to, and I'm going to correct that before you all get these slides, is that the original cohort started in 1948. It was 5,209 individuals. 55% of individuals in the study were female. In 1971, there was a shift, deciding that the children of the original cohort and their spouses were the demographic population. Then in 2002, there was the children of the offspring cohort. So this is a third generation study. But what I found most interesting, and when I think about the methodology, their approach for recruitment, it certainly parallels a lot of the things that we know are effective in being able to do these kinds of studies. But what I found most interesting is the original study started in 1948, and it was not until 1994 that 506 individuals were from diverse backgrounds. So you have a study that is cited often, again, the Framingham Heart Study, but the perspectives are very narrow. So therefore, when you think about the work that has been done around understanding the results of understanding about cardiovascular disease, a true component was missing. The study really talks about that. The investigators recognized the disadvantages of a cohort that was predominantly white and of European descent. So what I want you to take away from this is to understand currently what you are doing in terms of the work that you are doing and who's missing, who's not present, and why. Take the deeper dive into the why. If it's building relationships, I mean, you're not going to be able to go into communities of color and say, I want to come in and increase the study section. I want to, I have something that may be of value to you when you haven't even built any relationships in the community. People don't trust research. BIPOC people don't trust research. And it is hard for them to think about how this would benefit them. So you have to start by going into communities and being a part of the work that they are doing. Sometimes it's just a matter of showing up to show that you care and that you're concerned. And then from there, build the relationships that help you to really understand what the community needs. Individuals that are in communities are experts over their life. Let's not devalue that by thinking that we, because we're a research institution, are the experts over others' lives. Next slide, please. Yeah, next slide, because I want to leave a few minutes for questions. When we think about access to resources, what's the matter? They're going the same distance, but look, on my left, you have an individual who is has majority status that has no barriers. And when you think about the person on the right who looks like me, there are many barriers that are put in front for access. We have to do a better job removing the structural barriers that don't level the access playing field. Next slide. There's unequal opportunity, we know, as it relates to race and education and our education systems. We need to be developing pipelines, and we have them, career pathway programs, we have them here as part of our office to train individuals on research, to have representation related to research so that individuals can go back into their communities. These are trusted individuals, can go back into their community and to educate others about the impact and importance of research. Next slide. Next slide. Next. Next slide. So in essence, now what? We know the historical aspect. We know the issues that we are facing in terms of unequalness. How do we get to a state of inclusion and equity? At least increase a sense of belonging. Next slide. Next slide. So when we think about diversity, equity, inclusion, leadership competencies, we want to build dedicated diversity capacity, education and training, collegial engagement of the campus community, collegial engagement with our stakeholders internally as well as externally, strategic planning for diversity, equity, and inclusion, develop diversity leaders, invest in our resources, build accountability techniques. It's really important. It's one thing to say you are going to do this work, but where's the systems of accountability that hold us accountable for being equitable, more equitable and inclusive? We need to develop the incentive to encourage change. Find meaning in the chaos. There's plenty of chaos and uncertainty around us. Develop a strategic diversity, equity, and inclusion scorecard. We can help you do that here. It is to say, how are we making the progress and what are we actually comparing that progress to? And communicate the diversity, equity, and inclusion brand. We are working very diligently across our campus to do that, but it takes all of us and not just the work that's coming out of our office. What I would like to leave you with is, when I think about a call to action, what are you going to do, thinking about the socio-ecological model, to change the course from the inequities to equity and inclusion at the individual, interpersonal, community, and structural level? Next slide. In the words of Amanda Gorman, I'm a firm believer that often terror is trying to tell us of a force far greater than despair. In this way, I look at fear not as cowardice, but as call forward, a summons to fight for what we hold dear. And yes, I am still terrified every day, yet fear cannot be love trying its best in the dark. So do not fear your fear, own it, free it. The truth is, hope isn't a promise we give, it's a promise we must live. Uncertainty is the certainty we live with every day, but it brings such opportunity for change, and we all are responsible to help create control in uncontrollable situations. Next slide. Make the commitment to lead with humility and inclusion for strategic, systemic, and sustainable change, and that we are grounded in equity and inclusion. It's been my pleasure and my privilege to be with you today.